Dan sipawoyak ka kiona naskum nao bi dom kape nito tawinan. Hello, everyone. I'd like to thank you all once again for coming to listen to us here today. And we hope we have a really interesting program for you today with Kathleen Ash-Milby. Before we get on to the proceedings, I'd like to begin by paying our respects to the First Nations, Inuit and Métis from the lands of the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Huron-Wendat nations. To the elders past and present, and to those yet to come, we pay our respects. And to those who are courageous enough to venture across the cultural abyss that exists in this country, we pay our respects. To those struggling to protect their lands and their rights, we pay our respects. To those who defended and continue to defend their lands, and to those who gave their lives so that others could stand strong, we pay our respects. And to those who reclaim their languages and revitalize their traditional practices, and to those who maintain the old songs and create new ones, we pay our respects. And finally, we pay our respects to those who use art as a voice of our time. So please welcome Kathleen Ash-Milby to Wapatah Center's 6th In Conversation event as part of our Indigenizing the Art Museum virtual series, which is an initiative that opens up a dialogue with curators who are on the forefront of indigenizing art museums and who are examining institutional collections and archives from around the world. The series was developed by our Wapatah team as part of our global indigeneity outreach initiatives, which is led by Brittany Pitsiolak-Bergen, Natalia Chestopolova, and Mariah Miwasigi. I'd also like to thank and acknowledge Onsite Gallery's Lisa Smith, who's been a key partner on this and other projects, such as the virtual platform for Indigenous art. And I'd also like to thank the president of OCAD University, Anna Serrano, who's underwritten this series. As well, I'd like to thank the Canada Council for the Arts for their ongoing support of Wapatah. So once this event today is underway, I'm going to invite you to use the Q&A chat to post your comments and questions along the way. And depending on the available time at the end, your questions will be shared with Kathleen. So thank you very much. Okay, let me introduce Kathleen Ash-Milby. Kathleen is a member of the Navajo Nation. She was appointed to her curatorial position at the Portland Art Museum in 2019. Her responsibilities include research, documentation, exhibitions, and care of both the historic as well as the contemporary art collections. Previous to coming to Portland, I knew Kathleen as the associate curator at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian in the New York branch, where she organized several exhibitions, such as Transformers, Native Art in Light and Sound in 2017, the K Walking Stick exhibition, an American artist in 2015, and Off the Map, Landscapes and Native Imagination in 2007. She's also co-curated a number of exhibitions, one in particular, Site Santa Fe in 2016, also one in Australia at the Samstag Museum of Art in Brisbane, Adelaide, New Zealand, Australia, the University of Southern Australia in 2011. And also she co-curated a collateral event at the Venice Biennale in 2007. She's been very busy, of course, outside the museum world and working with the Indigenous art community. From 2011 to 2015, she was the president of the Native American Art Studies Association. Kathleen has earned a Master of Arts degree from the University of New Mexico in Native American Art History and her bachelor's degree from the University of Washington. So, Kathleen, yate.
Hey, thank you, Gerald, for that nice introduction. I'm joining you today from Portland, Oregon. I'm new to this territory, so I want to acknowledge the indigenous people of this region. These include the Willamette, Tumwater, Clackamas, Cathlamet, Molalla, Multnomah, and Watlala Chinook peoples, and the Tualatin Kalapuya, who are today part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde.
So, Kathleen, I see that COVID has kept you away from your hairstylist.
Yeah,
I've
this is
only
my
known
COVID hair.
I've only known you with short hair.
You'll know it's back to normal when I cut my hair. We're not quite there yet.
Well, congratulations on your position, your new position at the Portland Art Museum, where you've been with them for a couple of years now. It must have been quite a shift coming from New York after many years there.
Yeah. It's hard to believe I was in New York City, working in one capacity or another for, oh my gosh, 25 years.
Well,
A
maybe
long
that's a
time.
good place to begin. That's a good place to begin. Okay, so your life and work in New York, because I think that's sort of critical to your development. Of course, you and I have known each other since the mid 90s. You were a research assistant at the National Museum of the American Indian, and I was being continually brought into New York or Washington to participate in the workshops in the build up to the 2004 opening of the National Museum of the American Indian. So time has obviously gone by. We've aged very, very well, and the museum is up and going. So that's all. That's all positive. But I do know that you've been a curator for the last 15 and 25 years. I know much of your work in the 15 and 20 years, I should say. But let's go back a little further to the 80s and 90s, because I know that you had a significant part in your development during that period. And what I know of New York, and perhaps you do as well, and we'll talk about it, is that New York has not been that kind to Indigenous artists. But last week, we spoke with Patricia Norby from the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So, it's coming along. Things are happening, and I'm really, really pleased. We're really, of course, very proud of Patricia being there. But now you're out in Portland. But as I said, let's go back to those early days in the 80s and 90s, perhaps. I know sometimes some of the events predate you, but you're familiar with the history enough. And one I wanted to start off with is the American Indian Community House. And I know you worked there. And it was the only space for the longest time in New York which exhibited or was an exhibit space for a lot of Indigenous art. And it's been around since the 1970s. So can you tell us a bit about the history of that? Because I know you do. And it's also a place where you got your start. So maybe you can talk a bit about your curatorial work as well.
Sure. Okay, so maybe we'll get our slides going here. I pulled some slides to give some of this
Okay.
background. So I moved to New York actually to start my job at the National Museum of the American Indian in 1993 as a research assistant. So that's around the time we met. So I was new to New York City and new to the region, and a lot of people worked at NMAI. And so I found out very quickly about the American Indian Community House, which was a social services organization providing job support training, things like that. But one of the reasons I heard about it is because they had an art gallery. So the gallery was founded in the late 70s by the first curator there, Pete Jemison, who was working closely with Jolene Rickard. And this image is an image of the catalog cover for one of their really important early exhibitions, Women of Sweetgrass, Cedar, and Sage, from 1985. And there's a really great portrait of a number of the artists who were in the exhibition out on the street outside the gallery, which I think really gives you kind of a little bit of the flavor of the time, which was, a period where there in the 70s and the 80s and still in the early 90s when I moved to New York, there weren't places that were exhibiting Native American art, but the American Indian Community House Gallery was one of them.
Hmm. So, curating for Indigenous contemporary art is not, as we know, not just putting up exhibitions, um, but it's also about relation building. And I think relationship building is really important because it connects with other curators, other institutions, um, just, and I think New York is so enormous that you need to develop those kind of relations. Now, there's a chap that came after Pete Jemison by the name of Lloyd Oxendine. And the late Lloyd Oxendine, I Googled him recently and found that he'd passed away around 2015. But, reading him and reading his biography, he really pounded the pavement, helping Indigenous artists in the city. In fact, very early on in the early 70s, I believe he wrote an important piece in Art in America, which was unheard of at that time. And so I think people should check that out. And he talks about 13 artists who, many of them we do know, and others you've kind of forgotten through time. But can you maybe talk a bit about the behind of the scenes work that maybe Lloyd and others have done, and perhaps uh, how they actually help move the dial for Indigenous artists and art in New York City?
Sure. It's great that you brought up Lloyd. Lloyd succeeded Pete Jemison at the community house as the curator. He had actually started his own commercial art gallery very early in the early 70s for a short time. That doesn't actually get a lot of there's not a lot of information about it. And that was around the time that he made these connections and convinced the editor at the time at Art in America to do a Native American issue. And Lloyd contributed the article on contemporary art. But the rest of the magazine was there was something by Vine Deloria, there was something about the depiction of Native people in Western movies. It wasn't, even though it was an issue of Art in America, it wasn't focused on Native art, except for really, there were a couple of articles, but really contemporary art was really just Lloyd's article. So that was a really big deal. No one was really paying attention to Native American art anywhere, really, contemporary Native American art in the 70s and 80s. And artists like Lloyd, because he was a practicing artist, as is Pete Jemison, artists had to step up and fill that void and become the curators of these exhibitions in order for these exhibitions to happen. You can see on the screen in this group of artists on the street, Jean Quick to See Smith is there. She's someone also who was really a strong advocate for other artists and organizing exhibitions and really making things happen. So by the time I got to New York in 93, Lloyd had just left the gallery and Joanna Bigfeather, another artist, had taken that position at the community house. So the 90s, it was really a scene. This is when a lot of these nonprofit art galleries were popping up around the country and for Native artists. And that was really the only place a lot of people could be assured of getting a show.
Yeah, I remember going in to New York in the late 80s and all through the 90s, like like Lloyd, pounding the pavement, trying to get Indigenous artists known in New York City, and it was very difficult and still is, but slowly some of them are coming along. So maybe we'll talk about a few of them. Now, let's go to the next slide, because the next slide is an exhibition that you curated at the American Indian Community House called Mother Love. It's your first exhibition. I'm sure it was, for a young curator, it's pretty scary to make a public presentation as it is. Could you talk a bit about your early curatorial career and perhaps the lens through which you were inspired to become a curator, and perhaps how you were motivated by something or someone else?
Yeah. Well, I started out in art history, and I didn't go to school thinking that I was going to be working in a museum or be an art curator, but I was really interested in art and became an art history major, and eventually found out that one of the potential paths you could take as a professional would be working in a museum. The thing that really sealed the deal for me is I came to New York in the summer of 1990 to do an internship through the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I was assigned to the medieval department. And so I was based at the cloisters. And it was a great internship program, introduced you to lots of different parts of the museum field. But the thing that really sealed it for me was a friend of a friend who was an artist in town contacted me and said, "Oh, I heard about this exhibition that's really great. It's called the Decade Show," and that exhibition was in 3 different museums in the city. I had 2 of them. Let's see, Museum del Barrio, the New Museum, and oh, what was the other one? I can't remember the other museum, but the Studio Museum in Harlem. So, so we on the weekends we went and checked out this exhibition, and it was the first time I saw contemporary Native American art. For real, it was like this amazing experience. I saw Kay Walking Stick's work for the first time, Edgar Hooper Birds, and I was introduced to the work of James Luna.
Mm.
He had done that piece, that really iconic piece, the artifact piece.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the performance wasn't happening when I went to visit, but the case that was there with his imprint in the sand. And I bought the catalog and read about the artist. There was this really great essay by Jimmy Durham that talked about the artists in the exhibitions in a way that I had never seen artists talked about in a really interesting way. So that got me very excited about contemporary Native American art. And so the two experiences, having the museum internship, seeing this path towards working in museums, and then being introduced to contemporary Native American art in a way I had never seen before, that was like really set my path going forward. So I went to grad school. I got this job at NMAI in the Bronx,
Mm-hmm.
and worked as a research assistant for about 6 years. And then I left the museum, and this is when you were working with the museum quite closely, and everyone had to move to Washington, D.C. And
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to move to Washington, D.C. at that time. I wasn't interested in transferring there. So I ended up leaving my position. And that's when I started working for the American Indian Community House Gallery.
Mm.
And Joanna had just left the position there, and they were just asking me to be like a guest curator and to help sort of fill in a little bit, not like the full-time curator, but just trying to make do. And the first exhibition I organized was the one that's up on the screen, Mother Love, Native Women in the Land, which was related. The idea behind that was the relationship between Native women and land and landscape. So, and you'll see Laura Ortman's there, and Nadima Agard, Tara O'Keefe, and Sally Larson, a photographer.
Yes,
So I had a great time there.
Yeah, I remember them. I wish I would have known that you were working at the cloisters, because I remember reading a book in the late 80s called by Thomas Hoving, who was working. He was the director of the museum, the Metropolitan Museum, and it's a story of him chasing this cross that in a book called The King of the Confessors. It was just the most fascinating book, and this cross that he spent years and years and years chasing down eventually ended up at the cloisters. So years later, I did manage to see it, but I wish I would have known you were there, because you would have showed me behind the scenes, obviously.
I was just an intern, Gerald.
But those kind of things you get inspired by other curators and how they chase works down, because I do have, I'm not going to tell you the story here, but I have a similar story of chasing work down. It took me about 10 years to chase a work down, but that is just a fascinating book for curators to read, The King of the Confessors by Thomas Hoving. Anyhow, let's shift to the next slide, because now you've left the I'm saying your American Indian Community House. You've now begun working at the National Museum of the American Indian. And you leave this very, very small gallery where obviously you're chasing money all the time to a museum that's quite large, right? It's got lots of money. It's got exhibition space. However, it's an interdisciplinary space. It's not just art. Art seems to be a very, very small part of it. And as I said, when you and I met, you were a research assistant. But now you have this opportunity to curate an exhibitions. You have the space, you have the money, you have an opportunity to work with artists. You know, you do thematic shows, you do one-person shows, et cetera, et cetera. Your first exhibition that we have up here is called Off the Map. It was a group exhibition, but also what comes with money, opportunities to create catalogs, you know, and catalogs often are the opportunity to leave that the residuals of the exhibition. They last forever. So it must have been really exciting for you to have the opportunity to do catalogs. So I was interested in how different was this exhibition from other contemporary shows that the National Museum of the American Indian had done up until that time. And our exhibitions done in New York, in this New York venue, different than those done in Washington, because for those out that are listening, the National Museum of the American has two venues, one in New York and one in Washington. So here you have these opportunities. I'm just wondering if you talk a little bit about that
Sure.
and through this exhibition. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so basically, I came back to NMAI after a 6-year hiatus while I was doing that work at the community house. And, you know, the Smithsonian is a very large organization, and it has a department for everything. The American Indian Community House was the opposite. There's like one person who does everything. So when I was working at the community house, I was able to get involved at all different levels of organizing an exhibition. And it was really good because as a research assistant, before I was assisting people with certain things on certain exhibitions, but I wasn't really getting into the nitty gritty and really having that experience of being responsible for all those different levels. So when I came back to NMAI, I was now a curator. I came back as an assistant curator and was able to organize my first show, which happened very, very quickly. I came back in 2005, and there was a spot open in early 2007, and they said, "Can you do something that quickly?" And I'm like, "Yeah, yeah, I'll do it. I'll do
Yeah.
it." So what NMAI up to that point had not done a lot of contemporary shows. They had done the series of single exhibitions called Continuum that Truman Lowe had worked on before this time. I think that you were working on New Tribe New York.
New Tribe,
I
New
think
York.
that
Yes.
was, yeah,
Yes.
that was coming up. And it was really a really great time to come back to NMAI because they were starting to get a lot more brave about doing contemporary Native art exhibitions, and they had a lot more confidence. And I think you were part of that because you knew what you were doing and you had the confidence to push these things forward. And with New Tribe New York and Off the Map, I think that we were starting to go in a direction where every show didn't have to be a huge group exhibition that covered every single theme in the Native art world. We were starting to realize, hey, we don't have to panic. We don't have to invite everyone because this is the only time we're going to get to do it. We can actually focus on an idea or a theme, and we don't have to have 20 artists. We can just, like Off the Map had 5 artists.
Mhm.
And so the theme was again, it's interesting. It's my second like originating exhibition is about landscape, but this was about imaginary
Mhm.
landscapes that weren't based in specific places. The fact that I got to do a catalog with this show right at the beginning was amazing because, like you said, they're such important records. And I feel like in some ways the exhibition has gotten more attention 10 and more years later than it did at the time. Because, you know, even in 2005, there weren't a lot of people covering in the press or anything like that.
Mhm. Can we go to the next slide? Because there's another slide from that project, I believe.
Oh, no, actually, this is a slide of Jeffrey Gibson's work.
Oh, okay. Well, let's go to Jeffrey Gibson then,
Yeah.
because you curated his work, and I know talking to you and you know, just knowing the work that you did with Jeffrey, it was quite exciting and very thrilling because his work has just taken off. So, what did this exhibition do for you and for Jeffrey, of course? Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Jeffrey was in Off the Map. And I had met Jeffrey when I was at the community house. He reached out to me like smart professional artist, like sent me a package of slides, actual slides, in 2002. And so I started a conversation with him about his work. I was really interested, did a studio visit. And we had a really nice connection because he was doing this almost like a proto landscape painting, these very abstract landscapes that he was creating. Like he was like creating this world, starting with the landscape. And one of the things I thought was really great was that we had a really interesting dialogue because he had all these different influences in his work that I found very exciting. Um, Things that were native influence, like Iroquois stacked beadwork, like you see in the middle of top of this image, the fringes and colors of fancy dancers and powwows. But his work was also informed by where he lived, and his life experiences. So graffiti and club culture. So we had this idea of creating these landscapes informed by all these different things, and just kind of being free to do what he wanted, without being prescribed by even like the reality of a real place. That was really the influence and the inspiration for Off the Map, and why I sort of built that exhibition.
Yeah. So I think we have another image here of Jeffrey's work. Maybe you want to continue along that lines and talk
Sure.
about working with him.
Yeah. So around the time, this is a little bit of an aside, but when you apply for a federal job, it's not a quick process. So I was like over a long period of time in the process of being rehired by NMAI, and at the same time working at the community house. So I had planned a solo exhibition of Jeffrey's work in 2005, which I ended up doing as a guest curator because I had gotten back to NMAI, and it was called Indigenous Anomaly. And this also included these landscapes, but now people were starting to appear in this landscape because the series was evolving. And it's great, in retrospect, it was his first solo exhibition in New York. He's had really great success. We've worked together several times over the years. In fact, I'm working now with him on organizing a site specific installation here in Portland. So, yeah, it's been great.
Yeah. So, having that opportunity to work with Jeffrey, solo person show, you then had an opportunity to work with Kay Walking Stick on another solo exhibition, and I'm so happy, and I'm sure a lot of people in the community are so happy that uh, Kay finally has a major exhibition of her work because she's been working for so long, certainly in the New York City area, and to be recognized for her achievements. So, and now this exhibition, I believe you said it took you about 5 years to do. Usually, you're pretty quick and you can do an exhibition in a couple of years, but this one, and I know what it means to do an exhibition for 5 years because I think for her work, to follow her. But what did you learn from working on this exhibition? And of
Sure.
course, the big question is what took so long,
Can we get the next slide up?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this other thread in my work has really been about looking at iconic, important Native artists who actually didn't get their due. When I spoke earlier about how there really wasn't a reception for Native artists in the 70s and the 80s and even the early 90s, there was a lot of really good work going on. And so artists like Kay Walking Stick um, had many exhibitions, smaller exhibitions. Kay had exhibited internationally at that point, but she hadn't had a major retrospective and a major monograph. And we know publications are important. We know that major monographs on important artists are important. So, so this is sort of like a separate thread of what I was doing there at the museum. So the thematic exhibitions, working with emerging artists like Jeffrey Gibson. But this other side was fixing things, right? Like setting the record straight, going back and giving this respect to these artists who had so much influence on the field. So yes, when you're doing a major project like this, especially when you're doing a life retrospective of someone who is so prolific, like Kay Walking Stick, it's amazing how much work it is. It's wonderful work because you get to know the artist so well and their work so well. I learned so much about her work. I thought I knew her work, right? But after spending so much time with her in her studio, looking at her archive, learning about her process, and then putting together this very major publication, it really made me really appreciate her work even more. And in the end, we had a fantastic exhibition. It opened in Washington, D.C., because her work is quite large scale and it's certainly more suited for the larger galleries in D.C. And it traveled. And, unlike the field at the time I did Off the Map, by 2015, our artists were starting to get coverage in the New York Times. The field was really shifting. And I think it really gave her this sort of new level of visibility she did not have before.
Mhm. Yeah, going to New York and attending the exhibitions in the rotunda of the George Gustav High Center has always been an excitement for me. But also, being in Washington as well is quite interesting as well. Very different audiences, obviously, right?
Yep.
Two very different audiences, New York and Washington, for sure. Now, let's go to the next slide because um, just prior to you arriving in Portland, you started to do the research on Oscar Howe. Now, Oscar Howe, for many who don't know, I want you to explain Oscar Howe, but what Oscar Howe represents is this kind of early indigenous modernity. When we think of contemporary artists, he's a post-war artist. I remember meeting his wife many, many years ago. Someday, Kathleen, I'll tell you the story when I met his wife and what their story was all about, and you'll probably learn about it in your research. But this show you start working on at NMAI now that you're at Portland continues there. So talk about that. Take us through the exhibition, what you're doing, what you hope to achieve by it, and obviously it's probably going to travel from New York to Portland. So
Yeah,
give us a sneak peek of what's going on.
sure. So the Oscar Howe retrospective is another one of these exhibitions in that thread of recognizing under-recognized artists. He is a 20th century artist. He was really a mid-century modernist. He passed away in 1983. So this is, going back further and working with an artist who's not living, which is different for me. But his work was so fundamental to the field of contemporary Native American art history. He was an artist who started his professional training at the studio that Dorothy Dunn created at the Santa Fe Indian School in the 1930s. So he was trained in a very traditional, what was recognized at the time as a very traditional type of painting, and very conventional in terms of its subjects, and very straightforward. But he was an artist who really broke out of that mold. And the field was changing. It wasn't just Oscar Howe, but his work was really just blazing this path in terms of its expressiveness, in terms of its relationship to modern art, at the same time retaining a relationship to Dakota traditions. So I think the thing that made him possibly most famous was that his work was rejected for competition from a very prominent Native American painting competition that was held by the Philbrook Museum. And he really was very upset that his work was rejected for competition because they said it wasn't Indian. It was a fine work, but not Indian art. So he wrote a very passionate letter, basically, saying that he was sick of institutions or these prescriptions from outsiders, like telling Native artists what was Native art, because he was a Native artist and, this is what he was doing. And I think a lot of people go back to that, to his words as a rallying cry for Native artists to be free to do what they want to do, like artists are doing today, working in many different media, drawing on many different sources, and not being kept within a box or definition of Native art. So, there's so much to say about Oscar Howe. I could go on for an hour, but I
Yeah.
won't. But we have a massive publication. I started working on this about 5 years ago. I mean,
Mm,
this. I think I've worked on this project actually longer than K Walking Sticks.
mm,
And luckily, when I accepted the job at the Portland Art Museum, NMAI agreed. Came to an agreement that I would be able to continue this project. And in my position here in Portland, that it would be co-organized now by the Portland Art Museum and NMAI, and I could continue working on the book. So the exhibition's going to open in New York in March of 2022, and
mm.
then it will travel to Portland in November of 2022. So I'm really excited about this project.
Very nice. Okay, let's go to the next slide because now we're shifting from New York to Portland,
Yeah.
where, of course, I'm so happy that you're there at Portland, and I'm eager to ask you many questions. But just before we get there, you talked about the statements that Oscar Howe had made about Indigenous contemporary art at the time, which are prophetic in many ways. And there's a similar artist in Canada in the late 40s, I believe it was, who was named by the name of Ellen Neal, who was similarly saying really profound things about Indigenous art as being part of Canadian art and part of that Canadian tradition. Of course, Indigenous peoples were still locked on reserves and places like that. And so, to have contemporary artists at that time really not only just struggling, but also saying that we need our traditions back because, up until then, so much had been erased. And so you have artists like her who then, which eventually led to artists such as Bill Reed, um, Mungo Martin and others to continue that practice, So having those early voices and the research you're doing on Oscar Howe, I think a number of our younger art historians need to also start looking back beyond just the contemporary artists of today, but looking a little further back at some of these artists because they were the precursors to so much of what we know about and what's being produced today. So anyhow, um, going to Portland, leaving the National Museum of the American Indian, finally getting to do art, right? Where the context, where your colleagues are so familiar with your art, you don't have to explain much about the production, the process, artistic process. You won't have to put contemporary art at the mercy of those unfamiliar with contemporary art and art practice. So reflecting on those years in New York, the 25 years or so, how different are things, with Indigenous contemporary artists and what's happened?
Well, it was a completely different world when I started, even just 25 years ago. Um, we couldn't get critical attention for any of our exhibitions at the community house, and really the contemporary art exhibitions at NMAI at that time, and even in 2007, it was impossible to get attention. But I really feel like the field has come such a long ways because there have been tireless advocates out there continuing to um, talk to people, to make connections in these different museums in the contemporary art community, and really presenting ourselves as resources so that, because the usual excuse back then was, well, I don't know anything about Native American culture, so I'm not qualified to look at contemporary Native American art. Um, and we know that there are a lot of different lenses you can use to look at contemporary Native American art, and depending on your perspective, you're going to get something different, and you can be really deeply informed by the culture behind the art. But it's also art, and what people know about the art world and art, they can apply to Native American art as well. So I think that when I left New York, it was completely different. I had a conversation a couple years ago with the editor of Art in America, and they had reached out to me about this idea that they were cooking about doing another Native art issue. But I should say it was actually a Native art issue. It wasn't just everything Native like had been done in the early 70s. So, Native artists in the Whitney Biennial, and not just one year, it's happened a couple of times. It's so shifted. And so I don't want to say that I sort of felt like, okay, everything's good now, I can leave New York. That's not why I left. I left NMAI for this job at the Portland Art Museum, but it really was a wonderful opportunity, as you say, to work in an art museum for the first time, to be doing
Mhm.
my work in an art museum.
So what did they have waiting for you when you arrived in Portland?
So much. So much. Well, part of the issue was that there had been a 3-year gap between when I started and my predecessor left.
Mhm.
So just from the 3 years, there was a lot of things that had been put on hold, that hadn't been addressed because they were trying to hire for this position, and they didn't have anyone who worked with this material. So there was a lot of issues related to collections care, that needed immediate assistance. Um, there were, or I should say, there are several repatriation claims that hadn't been addressed. So, I told them, like at my interview, that, resolving these repatriation claims would be my first priority. So I've got those, in process. The first claim is gone through, and we're about ready to return some items. Um, and then there's just a really lively community here, and it's a really diverse community. There are a lot of different constituents. There are members who are really interested in Native American art and have really held the torch for the collection for a long time through a lot of changes. There's a very large Native community here in Portland in the region.
Mhm.
So there are a lot of different um, constituents and communities that needed attention. So
Sure. Now let's go to the next slide because the next slide is about more historical.
yeah.
Portland Art Museum is certainly one of the oldest museums in the U.S. and has been collecting Native American art since Second World War or before. So, what is its strengths and what's this collection about, and how important is it?
Sure. Well, the museum itself was founded in 1892, so it is one of the oldest museums in the country. But the first major collections acquisition was actually in 1949, and that was a collection of material that had been collected by a man named Axel Rasmussen, who was a school superintendent in Alaska in the early 20th century. And he was an amateur collector, and he started collecting from where he was living. So it was largely Tlingit material. Other Northwest Coast tribes in the area as well were represented in his collection. But it was a massive collection, and a really nice collection. So this was a highlight of the museum starting in the 1950s because it was this large original collection. And the museum continued to have the reputation of having this really important Native American art collection that started then. However, they didn't actually really hire a full-time curator of Native American art until the 1990s. So that's kind of an interesting sort of twist to that history.
Mhm.
Um, and then there was another major acquisition that happened in the 1990s, and that was a large collection of material from a collector named Elizabeth Cole Butler. Now,
Mhm.
she was not like Axel Rasmussen based in a region. She had wide-ranging tastes and interests. So her collection is actually very diverse, represents many, many different regions of the country. Seems like there's a lot of really strong plains material, but then she was also interested in baskets. So that was a tremendous addition to really diversify the collection.
Let's go to the next slide. Kathleen, like you, I've spent most of my career working in human history or ethnographic museums, as they call them. I did have an opportunity to work in an art gallery at the Art Gallery of Ontario for a few years. But working in art galleries do have their drawbacks, and one of them, of course, are collections. And I remember years and years ago talking with a friend of mine, a very important contemporary artist, who about having his work shown in an ethnographic museum. And, he says, I don't have a problem with that. He said, because why? I said, why is that? He said, well, my ancestors are here. I thought that was so profound to say. And, and I'm not sure what he'd say now, but perhaps I think a few other people would probably have a similar thought. And so I was thinking about this, that, working in art museums, they're mostly about European collections or other collections from around the world. But our ancestors, there's very few, so to speak, in art museums. And I've talked to other curators, and we've talked about, and it's costly, of course, to begin acquiring new works, particularly historic materials. It's slow. So I'm just wondering how the Portland Art Museum has handled this situation.
Yeah, well, you know, the Portland Art Museum is an art museum, but these items still have that connection to community. They still have that personal um, connection to living people. So I think that in an art museum, it is a little different because there is some education sometimes that has to take place about how we make these collections available to Native communities and artists, and how they have this ongoing relevance in the Native community. Uh, you know, Portland has had a long history, and it started out as a very traditional museum. And their path in terms of the care and stewardship of these objects has not been always a smooth one. But I think that they're making real efforts to right their path, so to speak. And I don't think that I would have taken this position if I didn't feel like they were moving in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
I think that one of the things that really impressed me when I came to interview was that they had already established a Native American advisory group. In fact, they were among the people who interviewed me. I had a separate interview with the Native Advisory Group, and I was so excited because there are a couple people in the group that I already knew, and those were Lillian Pitt and Marie Watt.
Mm-hmm.
So Native artists were part of this group, and I felt a lot more confident taking the position because I knew that I would be answerable to the local community here. And I'm an outsider. I'm not from Portland. My people are from, New Mexico.
Mm-hmm.
So I needed to have resources here that could help be liaisons for me and introduce me to people and help me with local protocol. And so I thought the museum was really at least starting in a good place by having that foundation of having that group and listening to that group and giving them some authority. So yeah, it's an ongoing process for sure, working out our relationship with the community.
Yeah, you mentioned Lillian Pitt. I think I recall it was Lillian who took me on a tour of the Portland Art Museum one night, and we saw an exhibition by that glass artist, that famous glass artist, Chaluli, I believe.
Tahuli, yeah.
Yeah, and I remember that because he had a collection of Navajo rugs that he'd collected over the years, and so it was an exhibition about that collection. That's what I remember, and I think it was Lillian who was taking me through the exhibition. So tell her I said hello next time you see her.
Oh, definitely. She's great.
Let's go to the next slide because I'm interested in this, some of the conundrums, the problems that someone such as yourself or others who are now working in art museums, because there's still kind of a residual effect, let's say, from the museum world. The discourse sometimes follows you into the art museum. And one of these, of course, is this idea of addressing and treating Indigenous art based on cultural areas, right?
Yeah.
And so that of course can be understandable and helps the public, but at the same time, it has other drawbacks. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about this, some ideas you might be thinking to change it, or maybe you like that idea. I don't know. So.
Oh, I think you know. Well, it's funny because this is an art museum, But the galleries, which were the last time they were redesigned and reinstalled was around 2000, which means that they were really designed in the 1990s, are based on what I would describe as a pretty standard anthropological model, which is that they're divided up by culture area, by geographic region. So there's a plains area. This is a detail of the one of the cases in the plains area. There's a northwest coast area. There's a southwest area. Um, and I think that this is it's a pretty old-fashioned model, and it certainly would make more sense to me in an anthropological or ethnographic museum than in an art museum. I feel like there are a lot of drawbacks to this arrangement, primarily being that it is presenting native art in these artificial silos, as if there wasn't connection between these regions and these groups. But it also is in a way making them seem like they're frozen in time, that there's a timelessness about these culture areas. So and also it's not based on the strengths of the collection. It's just I don't know, it's just a pattern that people go back to, and it can be problematic. So we're going to be reinstalling our entire native art galleries, collections galleries, probably within the next 5 years.
Mhm.
And I think that, we just need to shake it up. Let's just like wipe the slate clean.
Mhm.
Let's talk to experts in the material in our collection. Let's look at the strengths of our collection to start with, um, and talk to native artists and native community members. And I don't want to come to you and say I've got it all figured out, because I don't. I want to be open to having input from the people from these different communities into how we reimagine these galleries.
Mhm. So let's go to our final slide, an exhibition called Mesh. But Kathleen, so the conversations I've been having with many other curators have been very, very interesting, and I'm really excited you being there. But one of the things about moving into art museums is that I haven't, and it was something that as I'm a bit bothered by, and perhaps something I was looking more for the strategies behind curating and making changes. So I wasn't really interested in that idea of decolonizing the art spaces, but rather to indigenize them. And I think that was the nature of what this series is all about. So I'm hoping you're going to address that. And I have a few questions that I really hope you might be able to address. So what changes do you want to make in the future at the museum? And how have perhaps indigenous artists and working with knowledge keepers, et cetera, how have they influenced your way of seeing? And finally, do you have a big idea you're working on for your installations?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that was attractive to me about the position was that I got a sense that the curatorial department was very collegial, that there was a sense of camaraderie there right from the start. And we're a small museum. We're not like the Smithsonian. We have a curator for each of the subject areas, well, almost all the subject areas in the museum collection. So there's a photography curator, there's a graphic arts curator, there's Northwest art curator. Uh, and I realized that my work actually overlaps with almost every other curator's collection or their work, because we have native photographers, so that overlaps with the photo curator and collection. And a number of our artists like Lillian Pitt are from the Northwest, and that overlaps with the Northwest curators area. So to me, I saw this as a real advantage, because it was creating these bridges and these opportunities to collaborate with my colleagues and with these collections, and also interfacing with their audiences. Because if there's anything that I've learned over time, working in native collections, working with native people, working with native artists, is that no one works in a vacuum. Everyone is related and their work is related. And I'm very much into it's a cliche, but I'm very much into building bridges. And I think that one of the ways that we can indigenize art museums is by building these bridges with these other areas, other collections, other curators, and not just confine ourselves to our permanent collection galleries or galleries that are earmarked just for Native art. This exhibition, the next exhibition I'm working on here, is titled Mesh, and it's a group exhibition for artists. Lynette houses Lahuaukia, Leah Kolakowski, and Kayla Farrell-Smith. And these artists are all emerging, and I think Kayla, you might even call a mid-career artist or getting close. And it's a mixed media exhibition. There's a work here on the screen by Leah and by Lehua on the right. And this exhibition is actually going to be in a gallery in the Modern and Contemporary Art Center at the museum. So, I have a good relationship with the contemporary art curator, and there was an opportunity to use one of her spaces. And, I feel like Native American art should be appearing all over the museum. And I think that is part of that indigenizing work.
Well, I'm sure it is, and can't wait to get out to see you, come to the Portland Art Museum. And I really want to thank you, Kathleen, for sharing the past hour with us. And I'm sure our audience really appreciates not only the work that you did in New York, but of course, all those people now in Portland can share you. They're all excited to have you there. And you're going to be doing great things. And I want to thank you once again for joining us. I would also like to thank once again the university president, Anna Serrano, for underwriting this series, as well as the Canada Council for their generosity and continued support. I also wanted to do a shout out to Saide Akbari and Renzi Guaran from our ID department here at the university, without whom these would not have been so well run, right? With very few, if any, glitches. So please join us next week, which is May 20th, when we have a very interesting guest. And Kathleen, you may know John Hampton, who is an American. John is was a former curator. Now he is the director of the Mackenzie Art Gallery in Regina. So we're quite, that'll be a special conversation. So that's going to happen. And also later in the first 2 weeks of June, so we'll have a bit of a break, but come back in early June when I'll be speaking with Rianne Chartrand and Tara Hogue. So check out the full schedule that we've sent out. Our listing is on Eventbrite, as well as our Onsite Gallery Eventbrite page. And then, of course, our own Wapatah Center's website. So we look forward to seeing you here next week. Thank you very much, everyone, and have a great day. Bye-bye.